Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks, the weekly podcast in which I talk about a book that I've been reading, interview the author, and then something I've been looking at in the past week. But let me tell you what, I'm getting some great numbers from you folks. I appreciate it so very much. I have to ask you, please subscribe. Please tell your friends about this, but the numbers are just spectacular, not just on the podcast, which, you can get on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any place you get podcasts, but we're also putting it out on YouTube, just the audio. And I'm amazed at the numbers on this. I'm utterly amazed. So I know we're getting out there, we're reaching you, and I thank you so much for following along. I hope you're enjoying the books and the authors. They've just been outstanding, I think, this fall season. And, this is all brought to you by the good friends at Podcast Studio X. So, today we are going to be talking with Brinda Charry. Now, Brinda has written a book called The East Indian. And it's a book about the first Indian, not by Indian I mean from the Indian subcontinent, to come to America back in 1635. Yeah, this is a very interesting thing. Brinda's going to tell us a little bit about how she found out and discovered this situation, who the first person was, as well as the fact that there are some ties in here to Shakespeare. Yeah. So she's going to talk a little bit about that. She's going to tell us about her lead character, whose name is Tony, and some of the experiences he has over here in America, and the fact that he is considered an outlier. She'll get into all of that. She's going to get into all the research which she had to do. And let me tell you what, that is some intricate research she had to do for this book, because she gets into plants and cures and everything else. And I mean, you hear the whole thing about, what's going on and what this young boy got involved with. It's just amazing. And so, she's a very interesting guest. I think you're going to really enjoy the book. Again, its title is called The East Indian. The author, Brinda Charry. So without further ado, let's go right into that interview. Brinda, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Well, you have a wonderful backstory in yourself, in the sense that you were born over at India. And I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit. Where are you from in India? Where did you go to college over there? Things like that.
Yeah, I was born in the southern part of India, in the city of Madras, which is now known as Chennai, which is actually the same place from which my protagonist starts his journey. And I was born there, though I grew up mainly also in southern India, in the city of Bangalore, both very big cities. I mean, as 12 million, 13 million population. So I went to college. I got my undergrad degree there, and I got my master's too in English literature, mainly British literature. And I came to the United States, to Syracuse, in fact, upstate New York, for my PhD.
Now, did you take writing classes when you were in India, in that college there?
No, not really. I mean, the idea of creative writing classes simply did not exist. Certainly not back then. I don't know if it's changed now, but I mean, the idea was a writer learns by reading. And I think it served me well. I was exposed to many books, number of traditions, and I think that is what really shaped my writing.
I see. Well, you went to Syracuse, a fine school, upstate New York. What made you come over here, especially since you studied like Renaissance literature? I would have thought maybe England would have been a better location.
Well, I mean, there were a number of reasons, some of them to do with personal circumstances at that point, and my sister and brother already lived in the United States, so I just figured it would be less lonely here, yeah?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay. And Renaissance literature. I don't even think they taught that when I was in college. How did you get into that specialty?
Well, I mean, in India, right, at least when I was an undergrad, which is back in the 90s, we're talking here, I would say even today, the literature programs, they're heavily British literature oriented. India was a colony, right, up to 1947, which is really not a very long time ago in the sweep of history. And so really colonial hangover or whatever, but literature programs were really suffused with British literature. So I knew I was very well versed in British lit. And when I came here and I was thinking about what to pick what to work on, I went for the Renaissance. That is the literature of the late 1500s, early 1600s, Shakespearean contemporaries, really.
Uh-huh.
Syracuse had a fantastic program with some outstanding faculty. And I find the time period very fascinating. And that is what, in some sense, also motivated me to write the novel, The East Indian, because to me it's a big moment in history, and where in some ways the modern world, the world as we know it, is coming into being. And, it's the beginning of what we would call globalization, starting, of course, with Columbus coming to what they considered the New World, and then voyages to the East and the East India Company. And I was fascinated by that, and which is one of the reasons I chose to study the time period.
Now, did you always want to be a writer? Were you writing or writing stories at that time?
I was always writing. I don't know if I thought I would be a writer. In that sense, I'm of the Indian middle class, a supremely practical people. I didn't think in terms of, I want to be a writer or an artist. That kind of thing did not exist in my world. But I always wrote. I always enjoyed writing ever since I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. I've been scribbling away here.
I've read about you consider yourself a novelist turned academic, and now you've returned to being a novelist. Do you consider yourself now a full-time writer?
No, I don't. I do both, No, I'm an academic and a writer. And I would find it really strange to do nothing but writing. I need the structure and the regularity and all of those things that, academia gives me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, how long did it take you to write the book? Not the research, but the writing of the book, The East Indian. How long did that take you to write it, Brinda?
The writing, I would say, took me, a little over a year. It's a little bit fuzzy now, but I'd say a little over a year. I don't know if a lot of people tell me that's not too long, but I am a pretty fast writer. Once I get down to it, I tend to work pretty quickly. So a little over a year, I'd say.
Did you write this during the COVID period?
Yeah, partly in the COVID period, yes. Uh-huh.
Wow. Do you think that helped you in the sense that it made you focus on that? You couldn't do a lot of other things, so you were more focused on writing at that time?
In our case, it was really the first couple of months of COVID that we were teaching remotely. After that, we really got back to regular classes. So, of course, it was testing and all of that, but we got back to regular classes. So there wasn't a big difference in terms of my day-to-day life.
Oh.
Yeah.
Now, we said teaching. Where do you teach?
I teach at Keene State College, one of the University of New Hampshire campuses, up here in New Hampshire.
What was the inspiration behind the East Indian, and how much research did you have to do to get into that?
I came across a sort of popular history article that mentioned the presence of East Indians, as in people of the Indian subcontinent, in colonial America. And that was surprising to me. One always thinks of immigration from the Indian subcontinent as fairly recent. And I had no idea there were people from there from that long ago. And so I sort of tucked away the information and said, I'm going to write about this someday. And then when I decided I'm going to return to fiction, for me, that had to be, I did not want to write the modern immigrant story because I feel that had been done. And I wanted to go back to that moment, colonial America. And surprisingly, there's not that much fiction, at least fiction for adults, set in colonial Virginia, Jamestown. There's some, but not much. And I think recently there was another book. So I wanted to write about that. And I also wanted to write about the East Indians, certainly. But like I said earlier, I wanted to write about how in some ways an entirely new world was coming into being. These complicated global networks that connected India and England and America. And I wanted a protagonist who in some ways whose life was shaped by those networks. And that was really the inspiration for me. And it's the very fact that there was such a person and the importance, I think, of the time period is what really motivated me to write this novel.
Now, you said you found him on a ship's log, that there was a person named Tony. Is that correct?
No, not in a ship's log. He was mentioned in an article, and he was in a Virginia land record.
Oh, a land record. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
In the land record, George Menifee, who brings, this was the headright system under which for every one person you brought over, you got 50 acres of land. And what Menifee did is, Menifee himself, an Englishman who had come in the early 1620s, he registers a piece of land, a vast piece of land in what is now the Williamsburg area. And it was required that they list all the people they brought as headright. And amongst the names is Tony, East Indian, is what it's referred to as. Yeah.
So Tony is there. Okay. So this is a book basically about Tony and his story, and then many other stories too. But tell us a little bit about what the book is about.
Well, the book is about this young man, a boy at the start of the novel, and he is from southern India, and the East India Company traders are coming and they're starting to trade with India. And his mother becomes the mistress of one of them. And then a series of circumstances, and he finds himself in London, sent by the East India Company official to London. And the first chapter is India, the second chapter is London, and after that, he is what they call spirited. He's essentially abducted from London, along with a whole lot of other boys, English boys. And he is sent to Virginia to work as an indentured laborer. So I bring him to Virginia by chapter 3, and of course, this is the year 1635, so very, very long time ago. And I essentially tried to write about his life and how, in some sense, his identity is shaped by the happenings of this very, very new settlement. And so for me, it was a story of an East Indian boy. It was also a story of the Virginia settlement. I wanted it to be both at the same time. Yeah.
This book basically begins with a hanging of a witch at sea. Why did you begin it with that scene?
Where I got the scene from is I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of research for the novel, and I came across a hanging of a witch that did take place on a ship. It created such a vivid impression on me, this idea of a woman accused in the middle of a voyage and hanged right there on a ship. And I decided to start with that, partly because I wanted to draw attention to the fact that here is this woman, a witch, and she is certainly not a foreigner or an outsider, but she is, in some sense, also marginalized. She is on the ship. And I wanted to create the sense of a kind of bond, a connection, however slight, between her and this young Indian boy. And which is why, for me, I wanted to start with her. And she dies very early on, but he continues and he persists. And
You had the three, I think there are 3 young men on this.
Yeah.
It certainly shocked the heck out of them. It really brought a different type of reality to what they had been expecting. And he is in India. You said his mother was a mistress to somebody in the British East India Company. Now, when did they, and again, I don't know this, I should, but I don't, you probably do. When did the British East India Company arrive in the Indian subcontinent?
In the early 1600s. It was Queen Elizabeth who granted what is called a charter, which is essentially permissions to trade with India. They had a monopoly right to trade with India. And so they started coming in the early 1600s. They were not doing very well, frankly, for a very long time. And even in the time period that I start the novel, which is the 1630s, they were still not, they went on to be this huge, they're really the first example of a multinational corporation with tremendous power. They're the sort of Google and Apple of their day. And they actually ruled an entire country. They ruled India. People think England ruled India, but no, it was the East India Company that ruled India right up to 1857, actually. But in these early years, they were struggling a little bit. They were trying to set up, negotiate trade agreements. Things were not quite working out. So I really but they did start in the early 1600s. Yeah.
Okay. And you have the one gentleman who is involved there with Tony's mother. He actually wants to start his own, I don't know if it's a town or start his business, but he's got grand plans for himself. And was that common, too, for people to come over and do things like that?
He's considered the founder of Madras, which is the city I was born, and which is actually what I refer to, that Miss Frances Day. I see at some point in the novel, Tony says he went on to make history. I didn't realize it, but much later a sailor comes and tells him yes. And he went on to found what is really one of the biggest and the most important cities of India now. Yeah, but at that time, what he was really looking for was a little harbor, for the ships to. Yeah.
Right. Wow. I didn't pick that up. I didn't pick that this is a real person. But eventually, Tony gets shipped over to England by the British East India Company. And Was that a common route to send boys or children over there to England, or were they sending them anywhere there was a need?
From what one gathers, and of course this is a long time ago, it's really based on historical evidence, but it looks like young boys, not just boys actually, girls too, women too, were taken as servants. A lot of the time East India Company officials were going back and forth between India and England, and they took servants. And it's not quite clear if these Indians who went with them were servants or slaves, and I really could not find out enough about that. But let's say servants for now, and they went with the English officials as servants. So yes, there was an East Indian population in London, most of them brought as servants by the Englishmen. Yeah.
As we go along, was Tony lucky in getting shipped over to England, or unlucky? You think he would have done better maybe in staying in India, or do you think this is all it's for the better that some of these people then moved over to England and got in that servant situation?
Generally speaking, one should remember at this point in history, India was tremendously wealthy. They say it's probably the country with the highest per capita income in the world in the 1600s and, before colonization. So in some ways, it was not like today we talk of the modern immigrant as moving, looking for opportunity. But in those days, India was the place to move to, which is why the English and so on were coming. So to that extent, yeah, his life would have been better. But in the case of my particular protagonist, he is an orphan and he really has no one. And so to an extent, what happens to him just happens to him, yeah.
There are a lot of people who might not understand the difference between an indentured servant and a slave, because Tony and those who came over were not slaves. Could you explain that difference to everybody?
Yeah, early on in the settlement of the colonies, Virginia in particular, there was a huge demand for labor and tobacco was a labor-intensive crop. And what they did is they tried to fuel that demand by bringing over young men from England. And under the indentures, and there were laws governing indentured servitude, and the laws essentially said one works for a period of 7 years. And those 7 years, you essentially have to work for that particular master. And at the end of 7 years, you were given what are called freedom dues. You were given an axe and a set of clothing, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a bit of land and a little bit of cash. And then you could venture out and become an independent tobacco farmer. So it was essentially a 7-year, a bounded sort of servitude. That was what it started as, but essentially later, indentured servitude more or less died out and by slavery. But unlike slavery, it was not a lifelong bond, yeah. And they were not considered property. It does not imply the life of an indentured laborer was easy. It was pretty tough, and there are some cases of really, really brutal things happening to these young people. But it wasn't a lifelong bond, and they were not considered property. That is the important difference, yeah.
I like the fact that you showed throughout the book that these gentlemen who were indentured servants were free to go down to the local tavern or the local town and whatever and mingle with other people, as opposed to, I'm assuming, they wouldn't let their slaves do that, but the indentured servants did have those rights. Was this all involuntary? In Tony's case, he's picked up, on the streets. So is this how they basically got people over here, or were there people who were actually wanting to come over here to be indentured servants?
Oh, people were wanting to come. There's tremendous poverty in England. In fact, there's famine after famine sweeps England at this point in time. And I tried to indicate that in the London chapter, where you have people from the countryside floating into London and, starving essentially. And so many of them wanted to come here and, looking for a new start, looking for some means of livelihood. And most of them were voluntary workers, and some of them, however, this abduction thing was not made up. There were a number of boys who were picked up from the streets and essentially kidnapped. And there were big shots, important people, they say, were involved in this and making money off this. And in some cases, families were very poor and had so many children, and that's what I do with little Sammy. They agreed to send their little boy along so that at least it's like one less mouth to feed. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
One of the most interesting things was that when Tony arrives here, he realizes that even though he's here, he's still an outsider. Doesn't feel like he ever fits in. Could you explain that to everybody?
because of his background, he really doesn't belong to any of the major, for lack of a better word, the other ethnic or racial groups, right? He is certainly not English, he's not white, he is not of African heritage, so he's not among them. He's sometimes mistaken for Native American, but he's not Native American either. So the sense of sort of being in between worlds and never quite belonging to any of them is something that actually interested me, and that is something I wanted to write about. And I think that kind of informs the modern South Indian immigrant's identity too, of never really, belonging to any one particular group, in a country that seems to be structured along lines of black and white, and then there are sort of floating somewhere in between. Yeah.
Didn't they call him a Turk at one time?
Yeah.
Or consider him from Spain? Or they didn't quite know where to place him, because I guess most people in America at that time had no idea there was an India.
Exactly. They had no idea. And so he's, everything from a Moor to a Turk.
Yeah. So there he is. And he's only, 10 or 11, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Maybe a little. Yeah. So it's a hard life for him. There are a lot of fascinating characters in this book, both in this indentured servants group as well as the masters group. But one that I liked was Mad Marge. Where did you come up with the idea for Mad Marge, and what's her connection to Tony?
It's quite fascinating, really, to read the reasons why people came over. And, they came over poverty, some of them were kidnapped, but then there were cases where there were people who were what we would call mentally ill and whom they considered, essentially quote-unquote mad, and families essentially wanted to unburden themselves, of these individuals, and would put them on their ships and send them off to Virginia. And I wanted to include such a person, who's so extremely vulnerable in some ways and has no idea what is happening. And then here they are also in this new world, in this new place, part of all these other people who've come for all kinds of reasons. And I wanted Mad Marge also to be a person who, in some sense, the relationship between her and the boys is really quite a tender one. And she becomes something like a substitute mother figure for them, early on, though she might be mad. And later in the story, she kind of pops up at strategic points.
Yeah, I found that fascinating, Brinda. I found that really interesting, how you used her at certain points for that point. Yeah, I like that. Very good. What I didn't know was Tony is being transferred from one master to another master. Now, was that a common practice for these indentured servants to go from one to another?
It was very common. Tony is transferred, in fact, as the result of a gambling adventure, right? The two men gamble, and essentially the first master gambles him away. And I did read this happened, yeah.
I'm 70 years old. I lived my life here in America. I had no idea about some of that stuff. That's just, I say thank you for educating me.
Gambling was rampant. They loved gambling. That was the main entertainment in some ways. But then I did read there are a couple of cases where people gambled, and as a result of that, when they lost, they gave their servants away here.
Yeah. Now, he ends up, however, again through gambling, with another master, Master Walsh, if I'm not mistaken, who is a bit of an outdoorsman. Could you tell us a little bit about Master Walsh?
Yeah, Master Walsh is sort of a trapper, trader. He is a white man, an Englishman, but he lives very much in the margins of English society, and he ventures deep, deep into Indian territory to trade, Indian in this case being Native American territory, to trade with the natives. And yeah, so he is in some ways, he represents the kind of the rough woodsman trade, and as opposed to the tobacco planters, who were kind of more settled and looking for a more settled life. This man was looking for adventure, and he turns out to be a good master to Tony. A good master as far as masters go. He's good to Tony, and I wanted, in some sense, the time with him, I wanted to be a time of kind of respite for Tony, and a time, because he's been, having a hard time, but the time with Walsh is very brief, but it's a time of respite. And
Right. I don't need to go into the master before Walsh. He's a very nasty character who you have done a great job of illustrating with that. But Walsh was really interesting because he had Tony, and off they go into the wilderness. And all of a sudden they come upon a group of Native American Indians, and somebody shows a little block of ivory with some markings on that. Could you explain that to the followers out there?
I read about this. What happens is they find this little box which seems to have decorations, markings, which appear to be Asian. I mean, what we would call Asian, as in Chinese and Japanese and so on. And that's how it strikes the English. And then they figure that the Native American chief must have got it from Asia and therefore believe that Asia could not have been that far because they did not know, of course, at the size of the continent. And so they believe there must have been an ocean, but not too big a one. And I did read about this somewhere, which is where Tony and his master decide, and there were a number of such adventurers at the time who decided that it couldn't have been such a long passage to what they call the Western Sea, that's the Pacific Ocean. And of course, they didn't realize you have to go through thousands and thousands and thousands of miles before you get to the West Coast, yeah.
So they set out. How far do you think they actually got? Do you think they got out of Virginia?
No, not very far, really. I mean, a lot of people, someone asked me, did they get as far as like the Midwest? No, not really, because they've just been traveling for a week. Probably I was trying to indicate through the blue and so on. They were not much further than West Virginia, what we would call West Virginia, really. Yeah.
You described the Blue Mountain region pretty well. I figured that they couldn't have gotten much further than that, even though they were going like 4 weeks. But again, they still didn't know what had happened. But in the end, again, poor Tony, tragedy interrupts, and now Master Walsh is gone. They all head back east now with the Native American Indians. And what happens at that point to Tony? He gets traded, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah. I mean, he is unsure of what to do at this point. But at this point, I also, once his master Walsh dies, I indicate that out there in the mountains, he realizes there's no going back for him. There's no going back to his homeland. There's no going back to India. So he decides that he is Virginian and this is what he will be. And this is where he says, I will bloom where the wind lays me down or something of that sort. And the wind has laid him here and this is where he will be. And he lives with the Native Americans for a short time. One of them, to the extent he's also a brown person, but also definitely not one of them. And then they exchange him for a prisoner. One of their men has been taken prisoner by the English, and so they give Tony up to get their own man back. So he finds himself back in Jamestown at this point, yeah.
The people aren't too happy. They thought, well, we said it's going to be an Englishman. We thought it was going to be an Englishman, not Tony,
yeah.
Tony the Turk. No.
Yeah.
Oh, my. It didn't help. Well, one of the things you did, at least up through that point in the book, and maybe a couple of times afterwards, but you had a wonderful use of Indian religious sayings that Tony would always be falling back upon in hard times. Was that always your intention to have that as part of the book?
For me, I wasn't talking of a little boy who was overly religious or anything of that sort, but these are the stories told by his grandmother, the stories of the Hindu gods and so on, and the stories told by his grandmother. And for me, I wanted to talk about how, in some sense, traces of the past continue to stay with him, and he returns to them every now and then. But I don't know if it was noticeable as the novel went on. I had less and less of that because, in some sense, those memories do fade with time.
Then I'm sure it may be the same way with me with you came or others, that you go back to where you came from, and those memories and those things and those sayings or the people, you keep yourself company. And I know when I went to law school in California, I was always thinking about my mom and dad, always thinking about my college friends, because that gave me a comfort. And Tony seemed very comfortable, as he did with Shakespeare. Now, that was interesting. Tell us a little bit about Shakespeare and then how he comes into this story, please.
Well, I mean, how could I leave Shakespeare out, right, given my background, yeah. But one of the things about A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare's play, is a lot of people don't realize that the fairy queen and the fairy king are quarreling, and they're quarreling over an Indian boy. And that is something a lot of people overlook, the fact that the boy is Indian. And it is one of the few mentions, I'd say 3 or 4 mentions of India and Indian in the whole corpus of Shakespeare's work. And that always stayed with me. And I would think, this little boy, what was he even doing there? And what a strange lonely life in some ways. It is true a king and a queen are quarreling over you, but even then, what a strange, lonely life. And I decided to, in some sense, make him a kind of symbolic representation of Tony. So I have Tony watch the play in London, and the little Indian boy stays with him. The boy of the play, Shakespeare's boy, stays with him. And I tried to have that memory of the boy visit Tony every now and then through the narrative. Yeah,
I like that. Brinda. That was very good. I really enjoyed that use of Shakespeare in there. Now, one of the things I tell you about, you talk about research for this book. Those plants, I'll tell you, I never heard of these plants, and you have plant names and what they do. How did you find out all this?
Read and read and read. Yeah,
That's your answer to all. You were a big reader.
Yeah. I spent it was important for me. I know if I'd got one or two things wrong, people would not have caught it probably, but it was important to me to get it all right. So I did a lot of reading and the plants, what the plants were called then, and their medicinal properties and a whole lot of things. Yeah, so I did a lot of research, really. I kind of became an expert. I can grow tobacco now in the colonial way. Yeah.
Okay.
I read so much about it.
Have you tried that up in New Hampshire?
No, I don't think it's going to work. Yeah, not in this weather.
What's important, friends out there, about and why we talk about the plants and the medicinal properties is that Tony now gets attached to a doctor. Brinda, was he an actual doctor? Did he have a degree?
Well, there were a number of ways. It's quite debatable as to what an actual doctor was back then, because again, we are talking of the very beginnings of what we would consider institutionalized medicine, because one could become a doctor. Some people did go to university, but some people became doctors simply through apprenticeship. So how exactly Dr. Herman becomes a doctor is really not quite clear, because there were any number of paths too. Yeah.
Well, he seems to have an ability to make these, do you say physic? Is that what that was?
Physic, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And he makes this physics and helps people. And Tony eventually, as an apprentice, he becomes very good at this. The two of them, they don't have the closest relationship. You want to expand upon that a little bit?
I don't think of them not having a close relationship. It is more a professional relationship, I'd say, than anything else. One of the reasons is, of course, Tony is a little bit older himself. He's no longer the child he was. So to an extent, even with Master Walsh, he was looking for a kind of father figure, which he is no longer doing. And as far as he's concerned with Dr. Herman, he's here, he's there to be trained, and he hopes to be trained in medicine and move on. And so that is what I was really trying to convey, that it is a profession, but I think there's mutual respect, and Dr. Herman is not a bad master by any means. And initially, he doesn't really take Tony's apprenticeship that seriously and sets him up to do all kinds of manual labor, which did happen actually. A lot of young boys would sign up to be doctors' apprentices and were made to sweep the floor, essentially. And in fact, you have some of these young men complaining in courts, saying we've signed up to be apprentices, but we are, being made to do manual labor. But then later he changes his mind and he starts taking the training of Tony quite seriously.
It seems like every time that the doctor goes somewhere, Tony's making his own physics, and he's also giving them out to people. He's treating people, and the doctor doesn't quite like that much, or he's not getting paid anything for what he's doing. And there seemed to be a little bit of friction whenever Tony tried to do something on his own without the doctor.
Yeah, and also I think what I was trying to indicate is Tony is fortunate at this point because he is one of the few people of color, to use a modern term, who is actually sort of becoming a professional, who's actually a doctor. And he tries to use that to help the other servants and by giving out medication free and that kind of thing. And the doctor, doesn't quite approve of that. He's, as far as he's concerned, they're running a trade and Tony shouldn't be going around, doing charity.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe the doctor shouldn't go away for 2 weeks at a time either, huh?
Maybe.
They go to home, But it always seems for a longer time, every time Tony's doing something, it's being misinterpreted. You get to the middle of something, and then we get this whole situation of uprising by the indentured servants. Now, that was fascinating. Was that a historical fact?
Oh, yeah. There were any number of uprisings and a number of small ones. In fact, they erupted every now and then. The indentured servants did feel, and they were certainly exploited and treated pretty badly. And so they would rebel and organize these uprisings every now and then, demanding better conditions and so on. And the big one actually happens a little bit later. It was called Bacon's Rebellion, and that was a huge rebellion of indentured workers. Yeah.
That was different than the slave uprising or slave things, the indentured servants.
No, it was different. These are really the indentured servants. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tony's not part of that, though. I mean, he starts out as being going to be part of it, then he ends up not being part of it when it actually happens. And so he escapes any major sort of punishment or penalties. But you point out so well by the book how if you are convicted of the same crime and you're white versus you were African or black, you have different penalties. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly the case. And I mean, all evidence points to the fact that the punishments were much, much greater, everyone. And that is something that concerns him. And as you said, he is not directly part of the rebellion, but well, Ganter dies, right? Ganter dies,
right.
And to an extent, Tony is responsible. I mean, he was there, and at that point is when he worries that he is going to get into serious trouble as an East Indian servant who might have killed an Englishman.
What was the medicine that he gave Ganter, that Ganter was hooked on?
It was essentially, a Jimson weed was what we would call an opioid. It appears it still grows in Virginia and maybe South Carolina, who knows. But it grows out in the wild and it has the similar effects as an opioid. And Ganter more or less gets addicted to it. And then there was that whole scene, without giving away too much, where, yeah.
Right. What I was amazed at was that for the blacks who were accused and convicted of the same crimes as the white, their indentured servitude now became basically, I think, a slavery forever.
Yeah, and that is what a lot of people say. Many historians argue that in some sense it's one of those cases. What happens is runaways at the time in Virginia, from what we can see, are black and white servants. They ran away together. But what happens is when they are recovered, the white people are given, they add a few more years to their indenture, but the blacks, essentially it is now servitude for life. And some historians would argue that this is really where you see the beginnings of slavery, this difference in treatment, yeah.
I liked the part in the book, and I think we can talk about this because it's not a major portion of the book, where you have the two, I think they were from Angola, the two gentlemen from Angola who didn't even speak the same language. They were enemies and everything else, and they're thrown together as servants or slaves.
Yeah, yeah.
They eventually become friends, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, enemies back in Africa, and in fact, every now and then they bring that up, but they really don't have anyone but each other, and so I think that's what happens, right? I mean, under certain circumstances, I think we forge alliances we don't even expect, and I think it happens, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And again, even though Tony does find somebody, for him, he's still the only East Indian there. He's still by himself and decides to take off to Maryland. Now, is Maryland that much better than Virginia?
No, not particularly. And eventually, as we all know, Maryland went on to be what we would call a slave state. But in these early years, Maryland was still a very new settlement, while Virginia was at least, little, not that Virginia was an old settlement by any means, but Virginia was a little bit more established. But the laws in Maryland hadn't yet been worked out, and Maryland was really a Catholic settlement, right? It was the Catholics which is why Maryland. And so things were pretty much, I think the laws and the institutions like slavery and even indentured labor was not governed by such clear rules and regulations as Virginia, which is why a number of indentured servants, they ran south to the Carolinas and so on, but many of them they would cross the Chesapeake Bay and go to Maryland, yeah.
Mm-hmm. What's next for Brinda Charry? I know you're going to keep teaching, but do we have another novel, historical fiction? We're going to continue more with Tony. What's coming up for you?
Yeah, Scribner, my publisher, when I signed the contract for the East Indian, they required that I write a second novel. So I do have a 2-book contract with them, and I am working on the next novel. And I enjoy historical fiction, and I like being transported, taken back to the past. And I do believe there are important lessons and important legacies, both good and bad ones, that we've been left with by the past. So I've decided to write a story. It's really about popular entertainment, particularly magic. When I say magic, I don't mean real Merlin kind of wizards, but I mean performers of magic, stage performers. So I'm writing a novel based in New England largely this time on sort of popular entertainment and jugglers and magicians. And that was a remarkably international world. People came from all over to perform in. And this is set in the years of the early republic. So about 15, 20 years after America becomes the United States of America, after independence. So I set it in the early 1800s, and it is really based on stage magicians and their lives and their worlds. Yeah.
When can we expect that? Are we going to expect it in 2024, 2025? Is there a time period that you and Scribner are working on?
I will hand it over to them next year, but usually the publisher takes at least a year after the author hands over to release. Yeah.
Was this the working title, the East Indian?
It was the working title because that's what the land record said. It's a Tony East Indian is how he was referred to. So I kept it. We briefly considered changing it, but we decided to just keep it. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you could do that because so many authors, they have a working title and it's nothing like it ends up to be. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, but this is perfect for what it was here. But anyway. Well, Brinda, I appreciate you taking your time to chat with us today. It's been a lot of fun learning a little bit more about our history, which I didn't know, which is sort of an embarrassment to me. But we wish you the best of luck, and thank you so very much for coming on today with us on Books and Looks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor, and it's been a lot of fun, as you said. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Great. Friends, we'll be right back in a minute. Again, thanks to Brinda for coming on with us from up there and where she teaches up in New Hampshire. We appreciate her taking time out of her schedule to chat with us. Hope you've enjoyed it. I found it fascinating. The research was just out of this world, and I just found everything about this book very, very interesting. Well, what am I looking at? Well, for the first time, we're going to have 2 episodes coming out in 1 week. That's right, 2 days from now. That's right, 2 days from now. We're going to be coming out with another episode for you. It's about the book Charlie Chaplin versus America by Scott Eyman. Now you say, Blaine, why are you doing this? Well, I'll be very honest with you. They asked if we could put this out as part of the national rollout for Scott's book, and glad we could accommodate. Not everybody asked me to be part of the rollout, so we're really, really happy. Scott is a tremendous, tremendous biographer of that golden age of Hollywood. And as I always like to say, if you see him on Turner Classic Movies, he's written a book about him, or they've written in one of the books. I'll tell you, this is a fantastic book, and you're going to really enjoy learning about Charlie Chaplin and all his trials and tribulations. Scott's a great, great author and interview, and as a matter of fact, I think in the next couple of days, there's going to be a bunch of Chaplin movies. If you get TCM and you want to watch his stuff from the Great Dictator on, I heard that Scott's going to be like a guest host on that to talk about Chaplin. So we want to do that. That's what I'm looking at. Okay, I'm looking at Thursday. And 2 days from now, folks, 2 days, another one's coming out for you. Yeah, that's right. Another one's coming out, brought to you by, again, Podcast Studio X. We're doing all we can here, folks. So, I hope you're enjoying it because we're bringing a really, really good blend of talent and books here. So on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, for Books and Looks, this is Blaine DeSantis saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.